Hello my lovelies, welcome back to my channel. Today I decided to take our little conversation out to one of my favorite locations in my local community with all these beautiful murals. So I've been recently rereading Disability Visibility, which features a lot of essays from different disabled voices. And it really has gotten me thinking about the way I view my disabled identity and some conversations I've had with young disabled people who say that they really didn't get a chance to understand disability history. In today's video, I really wanted to focus on building some basic foundation in disability history, the models and some of the language, and then jumping into kind of my view of my disabled identity and the evolution of that identity. If you're new to my channel, my name is Isa. I am a disabled second-year graduate student studying communication studies with a focus on disability, culture, and identity. In this channel, I typically focus on the intersection of those two things, be it my research or my experience as a graduate student, trying to kind of take the lessons that I have learned and bring them to a more accessible platform. So let's jump in. So a lot of disabled advocates really start with the medical model of disability when they're introducing anyone to disability advocacy. And the medical model of disability is one of the older models of disability that kind of classifies the disabled body as something that is broken. It's something that needs to be fixed. There's a lot of language that comes with that, such as cripple. And in fact, even one of the scholars that I reference frequently in identity work worked with the disabled community, specifically with identity and stigma, which is Goffman in the 1950s and 60s. And he also classified disabilities using the medical model of disability. Oh my God. So Goffman. He was considered and is considered to be the grandfather of identity work in my field. And some of his early works really featured the disabled community, specifically those who were mentally ill and who had cognitive disabilities, and his goal was to help those individuals reintegrate into society. But he basically said that the disabled or mentally ill kind of experience was something that was very stigmatized, and he said that stigma stems from a moral judgment, and he even referenced Greek society and the ancient Greek belief that the disabled body was a reflection of the immorality inside the person. And if you know anything about disability, that's not what disability is, and it's so much more than that, and it's so much more beautiful. However, a lot of our society still functions with this model and still functions with this idea of disability. So let's jump into the next model of disability, which kind of really was birthed around the disability advocacy in primarily the 70s to 90s and still used in the early 2000s, which is the social model of disability. So the social model of disability classified disability as something that is created by an inaccessible society. A good example used in a lot of social model kind of language is that a child who needs glasses isn't considered disabled because we just get them glasses. We make the world accessible to them. We don't expect them to walk around without their glasses because then they couldn't see. And the social model really put the pressure on communities like in the United States to make things accessible, to kind of not necessarily eradicate the disability, but eradicate some of the inequalities and really fight for the rights to education and a job for disabled individuals, which is where the ADA really was born from, and a lot of this advocacy work that stems way earlier than when the ADA was developed in the 1990s. Alongside the social model of disability, there also was a huge push for person-first language with disabled individuals. So instead of being a disabled individual, you would consider yourself as a person with a disability. Particularly, other people need to consider you as a person with a disability. And this was super prominent from what I have grown up with you wouldn't say the wheelchair person, you would say the person in a wheelchair, which is still considered, I think, the appropriate thing to say today. But it gets a little more nuanced when we jump into identity first and some of the critiques of the social model of disability, because a lot of people found that using person-first language while kind of trying to humanize the disabled individual stripped them of the ability to really still identify as disabled. It kind of stigmatized disability, even in its attempt to destigmatize the disabled person. And so identity-first language was really born from social justice movements and the in the queer community and the Black liberation movement, where these marginalized identities really came forefront because they're not just important because of their marginalization, but also because they are part of who a person is, and it's that intersection of the marginalization and the internal experience of the identity. Anytime that we talk about disability advocacy and liberation, we really have to recognize that all of that was made possible by Black liberation movements and by Black social justice and by Black advocates, because they are the individuals who, especially at the intersection of disability and the Black identity, that made it possible to have the rights that we have today. So the social model of disability didn't really provide a lot of space for disabled individuals to still kind of feel at home in their disabled experience. A thing I said in my prospectus is that even if we eradicated all types of oppression and systemic kind of disenfranchisement and that kind of stuff, a disabled individual with chronic pain or a spinal issue like I have wouldn't suddenly stop being disabled if the world was suddenly accessible to them and people weren't awful to them. They'd still have a disabled internal experience. And as such, we see the birth of the social relational model of disability, which was done by some advocates that I can't remember at the top of my head right now. And I'll have the links down below for all this information, like always. So that was born from a UN kind of conversation, and the social relational model tried to kind of marry that idea of the internal experience of the disabled individual and the relational aspect of how you kind of connect with society, and that identity is born from that connection. Now, there is also one more model of disability that I want to touch on, even though it's not one that I particularly adhere to, especially in my research, and that is the pathic model of disability. The pathic model of disability was born from a lot of disabled advocates in the UK. And that is because, according to the articles that I'll include down below, they said that in the UK, a lot of the government tried to kind of push forth this idea of the, resilient disabled individual who overcomes everything within the social model of disability. And the pathic model of disability centers the pain of a disabled individual, both social pain and their physical pain. A lot of the people who are pushing for it are people who have chronic pain issues, really just trying to highlight hey, we still need things, we still need to grow, we still need to do better for the disabled community. And I think it's something that's important to touch on because it's a community that, particularly, I think, given the pandemic and those with high-risk status disabilities or chronic illness, kind of have been really affected by the pandemic. So something to think about, something to touch on. Now, what does this mean for my disabled identity? That is an interesting question. Hey, it's Issa several hours later in my car. I just wanted to provide some clarity on something. So, person first versus identity first language. There is no right answer. During my prospectus, my committee members were actually concerned on this issue because in my paper, I say I use both. The APA program book thing, it says to use both in the 7th edition, and that is because both frames of mind are very, very important for the disability community. And so personally, I identify as a disabled individual. However, I think it's honestly up to the individual to decide whether or not they identify as disabled or as a person with a disability. And my kind of rule of thumb is I'll say disabled community. However, I'll also say people with disabilities, depending on the context. Disabled community, I'm very much talking about the disabled identity and those who identify as disabled. And then people with disabilities are those that include the disabled community, but it's sometimes in my mind more broad. So I hope that provides some clarity. Let's get back into the video. So, growing up, I always centered my advocacy and awareness in my disabled identity because I found that was the way that I felt like I could interact most with my community. Because I always felt, and I was kind of, grew up with this idea that, it wasn't that bad. Like, yeah, it could be really bad. It could be very bad. I could have my life constantly, and it was constantly at risk. But when it came to like the everyday, I still got to dance and I still got to do all of these things, even with mobility aids. Even with mobility aids on and off, my embodied experience felt so separate, especially since I put a very specific, like, able-bodied focused front towards the able-bodied individuals in my life. And the only ways that I could see who I am as a disabled person come forward was when I went to things like Mito Camp and MDA Camp and connected with my community. So the way that I connected with my community when I no longer had access to those places was advocacy and speech and debate. And I distinctly remember giving a speech on mitochondrial disease, which was my diagnosis, and having judges say, like, why is this important? Like, why does it matter? And I would give statistics and I'd give numbers and I'd give stories and all of these things that I tried to do to make people think it was important. And I think that has affected the way I see my disability because I always have felt like the person in between, the person who advocates, the person who brings awareness. And COVID has really made me center my disabled experience and start thinking about what that means and stepping away from public advocacy and really working on it internally and working on it in my research and finding this middle ground where I balance who I am as an individual and what that means for this body today and what it looks like, and making myself more comfortable in my disabled body than focusing on translating my community's experience to others. And so it is at the same time like I am a member of the community, but I am not a representative of my entire community besides the awareness that I can bring with my research. But that is a very specific thing and it doesn't represent entirely me as an individual. I hope that nuance got across. It's complicated and I'm still working on it. And disability visibility has really challenged me to kind of question, how can I center my disabled identity, not so that it eats up everything else, but that it allows me to enjoy all of my other identities that much more. That allows me to enjoy art. It allows me to enjoy my YouTube. It allows me to enjoy coming out in places like this and finding ways that are more comfortable for me. So that's what I have to say today. I hope it was informational. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. If you like this content, like and subscribe. What has your experience been? Because I think it's ever evolving and I think the pandemic has shaped it a lot for me. So I would love to know what your thoughts are. And I'll see you real soon. Bye.